Let's talk about the best matrix system for placing composites. Welcome back. Today I want to talk about matrix systems and what I use for most of my composites. If you watched my amalgam video, you know that I don't use any amalgam at all in my practice. And if you're wondering why, just read the comment section in that video. Because even though we're trained that amalgam is safe, that it works, that the mercury release is something that is, not clinically significant, public perception is pretty against amalgam, and I am convinced that it is on the way out. And if you're a dentist or a student, you know how hard placing composites, especially posterior composites, can be. Amalgams are a little bit more forgiving. You don't have to be as precise with keeping everything dry, whereas composites, that is what matters. If you cannot keep your preparation dry for a composite, from day one, it's already a failure. With a posterior class 2, I still do think that the best system is a good sectional matrix system. And I use those when I can, which is like an ideal situation, a MO, a DO, an MOD, regular class 2 with a conservative prep. What I like about sectional matrix systems is you can basically injection mold the composite and it's shaped like a tooth. It's got great embrasures, it's got great contours, great contact, very minimal finishing. I really prefer a sectional matrix if I can use it. But like I said, in my hands, that's only for those ideal situations. And because I practice pretty conservatively, I'm in a smaller town, at least 3/4 of my composites have something like a really deep gingival margin. In my hands, at least, I can't get a sectional matrix to work very well. I either can't get the ring on the tooth, or I cannot get the matrix deep enough and dry enough to stay that way. Because of that, most of my composites, I actually use a system that's a standard tofflemire retainer with a specific band called the greater curve. Before I go any further, I feel like I need to mention this video is not sponsored. I pay the same for these matrix bands as everyone else does, but I do use them every day, and I think it is a great solution for composites. In my opinion, and you may disagree, but I think a standard matrix band has almost no place in composite dentistry because that matrix band, that was designed for amalgam. Now, a composite is different from amalgam in terms of the way it's placed. An amalgam needs to be condensed and packed really tightly together. Composites need to be formed and sculpted. But the most important part of the composite process is keeping everything really dry. That is where these greater curve bands really shine. Because they're so flared, they cinch very tightly on the gingival margin and they keep the prep dry. And again, if you have any experience placing posterior composites, especially with a deep gingival margin, you know that that can be the most frustrating part of that whole procedure. There's really nothing worse when you're placing a composite than etching and then seeing that your band is not all the way tight, that it's leaking. And you know how frustrating and how hard that can be to place these deep fillings. The greater curve technique, and this is what I use again for about 3/4 of my composites, involves cinching up the band very tightly, getting everything well isolated, and then taking time to form and sculpt the filling. And that's something I feel like I really need to mention about this band because with the sectional matrix, the contour is very forgiving. You place composite, it's going to be shaped almost perfectly, and there's very limited trimming that you have to do. Whereas with the greater curve, you really need to be intentional about building those contours in, about getting a good sloped marginal ridge, getting everything as perfect as you can before you cure the composite. Because I've been there before. If you try to just overbuild and then trim back, it never works as well. It's easy to gouge the tooth. It's easy to over polish and end up with something that's under contoured. And so with this technique, you really do have to be intentional about shaping the tooth before you cure it. Another thing I do want to mention is the contact. With either an amalgam or a sectional matrix, the contact actually comes from wedging the teeth apart a little bit, filling them, and then when you take the band out, the teeth physiologically come back together, you get a contact. The way the greater curve recommends, and I do use this technique, is to polish through the band up against the adjacent tooth and build the contact directly. Some dentists don't love this idea. Some people are uncomfortable. They're worried they're going to gouge the adjacent tooth. In my mind, that's not really an issue if you're using a finishing burr, but if that is a concern, Greater Curve does sell a micro thin band that I really like, and you can actually get a good contact that way just by burnishing that band against the tooth. It's so thin that you do still get a contact. But that is something that you should be aware of. So again, sectional matrix, I love them in an ideal situation, but I do find myself reaching for these Greater Curve bands probably 3/4 of the time. Now that's the posterior. What about the anterior? It's kind of the same thing. Like for a conventional ideal class 3, just a little mesiolingual, something like that, a number 8. I like the old Mylar and wedge. I think that works very well because you can cure through the Mylar. You can actually, push the filling up against the tooth as it's cured. That is very quick. I think it would be overkill to use a greater curve for something like that. But again, I am in a small town. We're doing a lot of, buying time on anterior teeth until we can get to the crown. Some of these things, I have no idea how I would do this without tools like the greater curve band. I couldn't do this with Mylar. There's no way. Again, this is not a sponsored video. I pay the same price for these as everybody else, and I do use these every day. I am going to put a link in the description to the website. There's a lot of good videos, a lot of good technique, step-by-step things that you can check out. I will say they sell a ton of different bands. There's different widths, there's different curves. They actually even make a brass one that's supposed to burnish a little bit better. I would say just start with the standard one. I can use that, and probably 90% of the time that I reach for these bands, it's a standard one. Maybe the micro thin one, which is the same geometry as the standard one, just a thinner material. Maybe that micro thin one if you really don't like the idea of trying to polish in a contact. Let me know what you think. If anybody else likes these bands, uses these bands, doesn't like these bands, or has another system that they recommend. Thank you so much. You guys are amazing. Talk to you very soon.